Chapter 18 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Storm. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox Jr. Chapter 18. Pausing at the pine to let his big black horse blow a while, Hale mounted and rode slowly down the green and gold gloom of the ravine. In his pocket was a quaint little letter from June to John Hale, thanking him for the beautiful garden, saying she was lonely and wanting him to come soon. From the low flank of the mountain he stopped, looking down on the cabin in Lonesome Cove. It was a dreaming summer day. Trees, air, blue sky and white cloud were all in a dream, and even the smoke lazing from the chimney seemed drifting away like the spirit of something human that cared little whither it might be borne. Something crimson emerged from the door and stopped in indecision on the steps of the porch. It moved again, stopped at the corner of the house, and then, moving on with a purpose, stopped once more and began to flicker slowly to and fro like a flame. June was working in her garden. Hale thought he would halloo to her, and then he decided to surprise her, and he went on down, hitched his horse and stole up to the garden fence. On the way he pulled up a bunch of weeds by the roots, and with them in his arms he noiselessly climbed the fence. June neither heard nor saw him. Her underlip was clenched tight between her teeth. The little cross swung violently at her throat, and she was so savagely wielding the light hoe he had given her that he thought at first she must be killing a snake, but she was only fighting to death every weed that dared to show its head. Her feet and her head were bare, her face was moist and flushed, and her hair was a tumbled heap of what was to him the rarest gold under the sun. The wind was still, the leaves were heavy with the richness of full growth. Bees were busy about June's head, and not another soul was in sight. "Good morning, little girl," he called cheerily. The hoe was arrested at the height of a vicious stroke, and the little girl whirled without a cry, but the blood from her pumping heart crimsoned her face and made her eyes shine with gladness. Her eyes went to her feet and her hands to her hair. "You oughtn't to slip up and startle a lady that way," she said with grave rebuke, and Hale looked humbled. "Now you just sit there and wait till I come back." "No, no, I want you to stay just as you are." "Honest?" Hale gravely crossed heart and body, and June gave out a happy little laugh, for he had caught that gesture, a favorite one, from her. Then suddenly, "How long?" She was thinking of what Dave said, but the subtle twist in her meaning passed Hale by. He raised his eyes to the sun, and June shook her head. "You got to go home 'fore sundown." She dropped her hoe and came over toward him. "What you doin' with those weeds?" "Going to plant them in our garden." Hale had got a theory from a garden book that the humble burdock, pigweed and other lowly plants were good for ornamental effect, and he wanted to experiment, but June gave a shrill whoop and fell to scornful laughter. Then she snatched the weeds from him and threw them over the fence. "Why, June! Not in my garden. Them staggerweeds, they kill cows," and she went off again. "I reckon you better consult me 'bout weeds next time. I don't know much 'bout flowers, but I've knowed all my life 'bout weeds." She laid so much emphasis on the word that Hale wondered for the moment if her words had a deeper meaning, but she went on. "Every spring I have to watch the cows for 2 weeks to keep 'em from eating those weeds." Her self-corrections were always made gravely now, and Hale consciously ignored them except when he had something to tell her that she ought to know. Everything, it seemed, she wanted to know. "Do they really kill cows?" June snapped her fingers. "Like that. But you just come on here," she added with pretty imperiousness. "I want to ask you some things." "What's that?" "Scarlet sage." "Scarlet sage," repeated June. "And that?" "Nasturtium, and that's oriental grass." "Nasturtium, oriental. And what's that vine?" "That comes from North Africa. They call it matrimonial vine." "What fer?" asked June quickly. "Because it clings so." Hale smiled, but June saw none of his humour. The married people she knew clung till the finger of death unclasped them. She pointed to a bunch of tall tropical looking plants with great spreading leaves and big green white stalks. "They're called Palmae Christi." "What?" "That's Latin. It means hands of Christ," said Hale with reverence. "You see how the leaves are spread out? Don't they look like hands?" "Not much," said June frankly. "What's Latin?" "Oh, that's a dead language that some people used a long, long time ago." "What do folks use it nowadays fer? Why don't they just say, 'Hands o' Christ'?" "I don't know," he said helplessly. "But maybe you'll study Latin some of these days." June shook her head. "Gettin' YOUR language is a big enough job fer me," she said with such quaint seriousness that Hale could not laugh. She looked up suddenly. "You been a long time gettin' over here." "Yes, and now you want to send me home before sundown." I'm afraid for you. Have you got a gun?" Hale tapped his breast pocket. "Always. What are you afraid of?" "The Falins." She clenched her hands. "I'd like to see one of them Falins touch ye," she added fiercely, and then she gave a quick look at the sun. "You better go now, Jack. I'm afraid for you. Where's your horse?" Hale waved his hand. "Down there." "All right, little girl," he said. "I ought to go anyway." And to humor her he started for the gate. There he bent to kiss her, but she drew back. "I'm afraid of Dave," she said, but she leaned on the gate and looked long at him with wistful eyes. "Jack," she said, and her eyes swam suddenly, "it'll most kill me, but I reckon you better not come over here much." Hale made light of it all. "Nonsense! I'm coming just as often as I can." June smiled then. "All right. I'll watch out fer ye." He went down the path, her eyes following him, and when he looked back from the spur he saw her sitting in the porch and watching that she might wave him farewell. Hale could not go over to Lonesome Cove much that summer, for he was away from the mountains a good part of the time, and it was a weary, racking summer for June when he was not there. The stepmother was a stern taskmistress, and the girl worked hard, but no night passed that she did not spend an hour or more on her books, and by degrees she bribed and stormed Bub into learning his ABCs and digging at the blueback spelling book. But all through the day there were times when she could play with the boy in the garden, and every afternoon when it was not raining she would slip away to a little ravine behind the cabin, where a log had fallen across a little brook, and there in the cool sun-pierced shadows she would study, read, and dream, with the water bubbling underneath and wood thrushes singing overhead. For Hale kept her well supplied with books. He had given her children's books at first, but she outgrew them when the first love story fell into her hands, and then he gave her novels, good old ones and the best of the new ones, and they were to her what water is to a thing athirst. But the happy days were when Hale was there. She had 1,000 questions for him to answer whenever he came, about birds, trees and flowers and the things she read in her books. The words she could not understand in them she marked, so that she could ask their meaning, and it was amazing how her vocabulary increased. Moreover, she was always trying to use the new words she learned, and her speech was thus a quaint mixture of vernacular, self-corrections and unexpected words. Happening once to have a volume of Keats in his pocket, he read some of it to her, and while she could not understand, the music of the lines fascinated her, and she had him leave that with her too. She never tired hearing him tell of the places where he had been and the people he knew, and the music and plays he had heard and seen. And when he told her that she too should see all those wonderful things some day, her deep eyes took fire and she dropped her head far back between her shoulders and looked long at the stars that held but little more wonder for her than the world of which he told. But each time he was there she grew noticeably shyer with him, and never once was the love theme between them taken up in open words. Hale was reluctant, if only because she was still such a child, and if he took her hand or put his own on her wonderful head, or his arm around her as they stood in the garden under the stars, he did it as to a child, though the leap in her eyes and the quickening of his own heart told him the lie that he was acting rightly to her and to himself. And no more now were there any breaking downs within her. There was only a calm faith that staggered him and gave him an ever-mounting sense of his responsibility for whatever might, through the part he had taken in moulding her life, be in store for her. When he was not there, life grew a little easier for her in time, because of her dreams, the patience that was built from them, and Hale's kindly words, the comfort of her garden and her books, and the blessed force of habit. For as time went on, she got consciously used to the rough life, the coarse food, and the rude ways of her own people and her own home. And though she relaxed not a bit in her own dainty cleanliness, the shrinking that she felt when she first arrived home came to her at longer and longer intervals. Once a week she went down to Uncle Billy's, where she watched the water-wheel dripping sun-jewels into the sluice, the kingfisher darting like a blue bolt upon his prey, and listening to the lullaby that the water played to the sleepy old mill, and stopping both ways to gossip with old Hun in her porch under the honeysuckle vines. Uncle Billy saw the change in her, and he grew vaguely uneasy about her. She dreamed so much, she was at times so restless, she asked so many questions he could not answer, and she failed to ask so many that were on the tip of her tongue. He saw that while her body was at home, her thoughts rarely were, and it all haunted him with a vague sense that he was losing her. But old Hun laughed at him and told him he was an old fool, and to "git another pair of specs," and maybe he could see that the little gal was in love. This started Uncle Billy, for he was so like a father to June that he was as slow as a father in recognizing that his child had grown to such absurd maturity. But looking back to the beginning, how the little girl had talked of the furriner who had come into Lonesome Cove all during the 6 months he was gone, how gladly she had gone away to the Gap to school, how anxious he was to go still farther away again, and remembering all the strange questions she asked him about things in the outside world of which he knew nothing, Uncle Billy shook his head in confirmation of his own conclusion, and with all his soul he wondered about Hale, what kind of a man he was, and what his purpose was with June. And of every man who passed his mill he never failed to ask if he knew that a man Hale, and what he knew. All he had heard had been in Hale's favor, except from young Dave Tolliver, the Red Fox, or from any Falin of the crowd which Hale had prevented from capturing Dave. Their statements bothered him, especially the Red Fox's evil hints and insinuations about Hale's purposes one day at the mill. The miller thought of them all the afternoon and all the way home, and when he sat down at his fire his eyes very naturally and simply rose to his old rifle over the door, and then he laughed to himself so loudly that old Hun heard him. "Are you going crazy, Billy?" she asked. "What you studyin' about?" "Nothin'. I was just a-thinkin' Devil Judd wouldn't leave a greased pot of him." "You air goin' crazy? Who's him?" Nobody," said Uncle Billy, and old Hun turned with a shrug of her shoulders. She was tired of all this talk about the feud. All that summer young Dave Tolliver hung around Lonesome Cove. He would sit for hours in Devil Judd's cabin, rarely saying anything to June or to anybody, though the girl felt that she hardly made a move that he did not see, and while he disappeared when Hale came, after a surly grunt of acknowledgment to Hale's cheerful greeting, his perpetual espionage began to anger June. Never, however, did he put himself into words, until Hale's last visit, when the summer had waned and it was nearly time for June to go away again to school. As usual, Dave had left the house when Hale came, and an hour after Hale was gone, she went to the little ravine with the book in her hand, and there the boy was sitting on her log, his elbows dug into his legs midway between thigh and knee, his chin in his hands, his slouched hat over his black eyes, every line of him picturing angry, sullen dejection. She would have slipped away, but he heard her and lifted his head and stared at her without speaking. Then he slowly got off the log and sat down on a moss-covered stone. "'Scuse me," he said with elaborate sarcasm. "This being your schoolhouse over here, and me not being a scholar, I reckon I'm in your way." "How do you happen to know it's my schoolhouse?" asked June quietly. "I've seed you here." "Just as I s'posed." "You an' him?" "Just as I s'posed," she repeated, and a spot of red came into each cheek. "But we didn't see you." Young Dave laughed. "Well, everybody don't always see me when I'm seein' them." "No," she said unsteadily. "So you've been sneakin' around through the woods a spyin' on me, sneakin' and spyin'," she repeated so searingly that Dave looked at the ground suddenly, picked up a pebble confusedly and shot it in the water. "I had a mighty good reason," he said doggedly. "If he'd been up to some of his furrin tricks—" June stamped the ground. "Don't you think I can take keer o' myself?" "No, I don't. I never seed a gal that could, with one o' them furriners." "Huh!" she said scornfully. "You seem to set a mighty big store by the decency of your own kin." Dave was silent. "He ain't up to no tricks. An' what do you reckon Dad'd be doin' while you was protectin' me?" "Air you goin' away to school?" he asked suddenly. June hesitated. "Well, seein' as it's none o' your business, I am. Air you goin' to marry him?" "He ain't axed me." The boy's face turned red as a flame. "Ye air honest with me, an' now I'm goin' to be honest with you. You ain't never goin' to marry him." "Maybe you think I'm goin' to marry you?" A mist of rage swept before the lad's eyes so that he could hardly see, but he repeated steadily, "You ain't goin' to marry him." June looked at the boy long and steadily, but his black eyes never wavered. She knew what he meant. "And he kept the Falins from killin' you," she said, quivering with indignation at the shame of him. But Dave went on unheeding. "You poor little fool, do ye reckon as how he's ever goin' to ax you to marry him? What's he sendin' you away fer? Because you ain't good enough fer him. Whar's your pride? You ain't good enough fer him," he repeated scathingly. June had grown calm now. "I know it," she said quietly, "but I'm going to try to be." Dave rose then in impotent fury and pointed one finger at her. His black eyes gleamed like a demon's and his voice was hoarse with resolution and rage, but it was Tolliver against Tolliver now, and June answered him with contemptuous fearlessness. "You ain't never goin' to marry him. And he kept the Falins from killin' ye." "Yes," he retorted savagely at last, "and I kept the Falins from killin' him," and he stalked away, leaving June blanched and wondering. It was true. Only an hour before, as Hale turned up the mountain that very afternoon at the mouth of Lonesome Cove, young Dave had called to him from the bushes and stepped into the road. "You are goin' to court Monday?" he said. "Yes," said Hale. "Well, you better take another road this time," he said quietly. "3 of the Falins will be waitin' in the laurel somewhere on the road to Layway ye." Hale was dumbfounded, but he knew the boy spoke the truth. "Look here," he said impulsively, "I've got nothing against you, and I hope you've got nothing against me. I'm much obliged. Let's shake hands." The boy turned sullenly away with a dogged shake of his head. "I was beholden to you," he said with dignity, "and I warned you 'bout them Falins to get even with you. We're quits now." Hale started to speak, to say that the lad was not beholden to him, that he would as quickly have protected a Falin, but it would have only made matters worse. Moreover, He knew precisely what Dave had against him, and that, too, was no matter for discussion. So he said simply and sincerely, "I'm sorry we can't be friends." "No," Dave gritted out, "not this side o' heaven or hell." Chapter 19.
Chapter 19 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr., Chapter 19. And still further into that far silence about which she used to dream at the base of the big pine went little June. At dusk, weary and travel-stained, she sat in the parlors of a hotel, a great gray column structure of stone. She was confused and bewildered, and her head ached. The journey had been long and tiresome. The swift motion of the train had made her dizzy and faint. The dust and smoke had almost stifled her, and even now the dismal parlors, rich and wonderful as they were to her unaccustomed eyes, oppressed her deeply. If she could have one more breath of mountain air. The day had been too full of wonders, impressions that crowded on her sensitive brain so thick and fast that the recollection of them was as through a haze. She had never been on a train before, and when, as it crashed ahead, she clutched Hale's arm in fear and asked how they stopped it, Hale, hearing the whistle blow for a station, said, "I'll show you," and he waved one hand out the window, and he repeated this trick twice before she saw it was a joke. All day he had soothed her uneasiness in some such way, and all day he watched her with an unusual smile that was puzzling to her. She remembered sadly watching the mountains dwindle and disappear, and when several of her own people who were on the train were left at way stations, it seemed as though all links that bound her to her home were broken. The face of the country changed, the people changed in looks, manners, and dress, and she shrank closer to Hale with an ever-increasing sense of painful loneliness. These level fields and these farmhouses, so strangely built, so varied in color, were the settlements, and these people, so nicely dressed, so clean and fresh-looking, were furriners. At one station a crowd of schoolgirls had got on board, and she had watched them with keen interest, mystified by their incessant chatter and gaiety. And at last had come the big city, with more smoke, more dust, more noise, more confusion, and she was in his world. That was the thought that comforted her. It was his world, and now she sat alone in the dismal parlors while Hale was gone to find his sister, waiting and trembling at the ordeal close upon her of meeting Helen Hale. Below, Hale found his sister and her maid registered, and a few minutes later he led Miss Hale into the parlor. As they entered, June rose without advancing, and for a moment the two stood facing each other, the still, roughly clad, primitive mountain girl and the exquisite modern woman, in an embarrassment equally painful to both. "June, this is my sister." At a loss what to do, Helen Hale simply stretched out her hand, but drawn by June's timidity and the quick admiration and fear in her eyes, she leaned suddenly forward and kissed her. A grateful flush overspread the little girl's features, and the pallor that instantly succeeded went straightway to the sister's heart. "You are not well," she said quietly and kindly. "You must go to your room at once. I am going to take care of you. You are my little sister now." June lost the subtlety in Miss Hale's emphasis, but she fell with instant submission under such gentle authority, and though she could say nothing, her eyes glistened and her lips quivered, and without looking at Hale she followed his sister out of the room. Hale stood still. He had watched the meeting with apprehension, and now, surprised and grateful, he went to Helen's parlor and waited with a hopeful heart. When his sister entered he rose eagerly. "Well," he said, stopping suddenly, for there were tears of vexation, dismay, and genuine distress on his sister's face. "Oh, Jack," she cried, "how could you? How could you?" Hale bit his lips, turned and paced the room. He had hoped too much, and yet what else could he have expected? His sister and June knew as little about each other and each other's lives as though they had occupied different planets. He had forgotten that Helen must be shocked by June's inaccuracies of speech and in 100 other ways to which he had become accustomed. With him, moreover, the process had been gradual, and moreover, he had been beneath it all, and yet he had foolishly expected Helen to understand everything at once. He was unjust, so very wisely he held himself in silence. "Where's her baggage, Jack?" Helen had opened her trunk and was lifting out the lid. "She ought to change those dusty clothes at once. You'd better ring and have it set right up." "No," said Hale. "I will go down and see about it myself." He returned presently, his face aflame with June's carpet-bag. "I believe this is all she has," he said quietly. In spite of herself, Helen's grief changed to a fit of helpless laughter, and, afraid to trust himself further, Hale rose to leave the room. At the door he was met by the negro maid. "Miss Helen," she said with an open smile, "Miss June say she don't want nothin'." Hale gave her a fiery look and hurried out. June was seated at a window. When he went into her room with her face buried in her arms, she lifted her head, dropped it, and he saw that her eyes were red with weeping. "Are you sick, little girl?" he asked anxiously. June shook her head helplessly. "You aren't homesick, are you?" "No." The answer came very faintly. "Don't you like my sister?" The head bowed an emphatic "Yes, yes." "Then what is the matter?" "Oh," she said despairingly between her sobs, "she won't like me. I never can be like her." Hale smiled, but her grief was so sincere that he leaned over her and with a tender hand soothed her into quiet. Then he went to Helen again, and he found her overhauling dresses. "I've brought along several things of different sizes, and I'm going to try at any rate. Oh," she added hastily, "only, of course, until she can get some clothes of her own." "Sure," said Hale, but his sister waved her hand, and again Hale kept still. June had bathed her eyes and was lying down when Helen entered, and she made not the slightest objection to anything the latter proposed. Straightway she fell under as complete subjection to her as she had done to Hale. Without a moment's hesitation she drew off her rudely fashioned dress and stood before Helen with utmost simplicity, her beautiful arms and throat bare, and her hair falling about them with the rich gold of a cloud at an autumn sunset. Dressed, she could hardly breathe, but when she looked at herself in the mirror she trembled. Magic transformation! Apparently the chasm between the two had been bridged in a single instant. Helen herself was astonished, and again her heart warmed toward the girl. When a little later she stood timidly under Hale's scrutiny, eagerly watching his face and flushing rosy with happiness under his brightening look, her brother had not exaggerated. The little girl was really beautiful. When they went down to the dining room there was another surprise for Helen Hale, for June's timidity was gone, and to the wonder of the woman she was clothed with an impassive reserve that in herself would have been little less than haughtiness, and as astounding in a child. She saw, too, that the change in the girl's bearing was unconscious, and that the presence of strangers had caused it. It was plain that June's timidity sprang from her love of Hale, her fear of not pleasing him and not pleasing her, his sister, and plain, too, that remarkable self-poise was little June's to command. At the table June kept her eyes fastened on Helen Hale. Not a movement escaped her, and she did nothing that was not done by one of the others first. She said nothing, but if she had to answer questions she spoke with such care and precision that she almost seemed to be using a foreign language. Miss Hale smiled, but with inward approval, and that night she was in better spirits. "Jack," she said when he came to bid her good night, "I think we'd better stay here a few days. I thought of course you were exaggerating, but she is very, very lovely, and that manner of hers, well, it passes my understanding. Just leave everything to me." Hale was very willing to do that. He had all trust in his sister's judgment. He knew her dislike of interference, her love of autocratic supervision, so he asked no questions, but in grateful relief kissed her good night. The sister sat for a long time at her window after he was gone. Her brother had been long away from civilization. He had become infatuated. The girl loved him. He was honorable, and in his heart he meant to marry her. That was to her the whole story. She had been mortified by the misstep, but the misstep made only one thought had occurred to her: to help him all she could. She had been appalled when she first saw the dusty, shrinking mountain girl, but the helplessness and the loneliness of the tired little face touched her, and she was straightway responsive to the mute appeal in the dark eyes that were lifted to her own with such modest fear and wonder. Now her surprise at her brother's infatuation was abating rapidly. The girl's adoration of him, her wild beauty, her strange winning personality, as rare and as independent of birth and circumstance as genius, had soon made that phenomenon plain. And now what was to be done? The girl was quick, observant, imitative, docile, and in the presence of strangers her gravity of manner gave the impression of uncanny self-possession. It seemed as though anything might be possible. At Helen's suggestion, then, the three stayed where they were for a week, for June's wardrobe was sadly in need of attention. So the week was spent in shopping, driving, and walking, and rapidly as it passed for Helen and Hale, it was to June the longest of her life. So filled was it with 1,000 sensations unfelt by them. The city had been stirred by the spirit of the New South, but the charm of the old was distinct everywhere. Architectural eccentricities had startled the sleepy, maple-shadowed rows of comfortable, uniformed dwellings here and there, and in some streets the life was brisk, but it was still possible to see pedestrians strolling with unconscious good humor around piles of goods on the sidewalk, businessmen stopping for a social chat on the street cars moving independent of time, men invariably giving up their seats to women, and strangers or not, depositing their fare for them, the drivers at the courteous personal service of each patron of the road, now holding a car and placidly whistling while some lady who had signaled from her doorway went back indoors for some forgotten article, now twisting the reins around the brakes and leaving a parcel in some yard, and no one grumbling. But what was to Hale an atmosphere of amusing leisure was to June bewildering confusion. To her his amusement was unintelligible, but through inconstant wonder at everything she saw, no one would ever have suspected that she was making her first acquaintance with city scenes. At first the calm unconcern of her companions had puzzled her. She could not understand how they could walk along heedless of the wonderful visions that beckoned to her from the shop windows, fearless of the strange noises about them, and scarcely noticing the great crowds of people or the strange shining vehicles that thronged the streets. But she had quickly concluded that it was one of the demands of the new life to see little and be astonished at nothing, and Helen and Hale, surprised in turn at her unconcern, little suspected the effort her self-suppression cost her. And when over some wonder she did lose herself, Hale would say, "Just wait till you see New York," and June would turn her dark eyes to Helen for confirmation and see if Hale could be joking with her. "It's all true, June," Helen would say. "You must go there some day. It's true." But that town was enough and too much for June. Her head buzzed continuously, and she could hardly sleep, and she was glad when one afternoon they took her into the country again, the bluegrass country, and to the little town near which Hale had been born, and which was a dream city to June, and to a school of which an old friend of his mother was principal, and in which Helen herself was a temporary teacher. And rumor had gone ahead of June. Hale had found her dashing about the mountains on the back of a wild bull, said rumor. She was as beautiful as Europa, was of pure English descent, and spoke the language of Shakespeare. The Honorable Sam Budd's hand was patent in this. She had saved Hale's life from moonshiners, and while he was really in love with her, he was pretending to educate her out of gratitude. And here doubtless was the faint tracery of Miss Anne Saunder's natural suspicions. And there Hale left her, under the eye of his sister, left her to absorb another new life like a thirsty plant, and come back to the mountains to make his head swim with new witcheries. End of chapter 19. 20th, The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Venditti, MikeVenditti.com. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 20. The boom started after its shadow through the hills now, and Hale watched it sweep toward him with grim satisfaction at the fulfillment of his own prophecy, and with disgust that by the irony of fate it should come from the very quarters where years before he had played the maddening part of lunatic at large. The avalanche was sweeping southward. Pennsylvania was creeping down the Alleghanies. Emissaries of New York capital were pouring into the hills. The tidewater of Virginia and the bluegrass region of Kentucky were sending in their best blood and youth, and friends of the helmeted Englishman were hurrying over the seas. Eastern companies were taking up principalities, and at Cumberland Gap those helmeted Englishmen had acquired a kingdom. They were building a town there, too, with huge steel plants, broad avenues, and business blocks that would have graced Broadway, and they were pouring out $1,000,000 for every $1,000 that it would have cost Hale to acquire the land on which the work was going on. Moreover, they were doing it there, as Hale heard, because they were too late to get control of his Gap through the Cumberland. At his Gap, too, the same movement was starting. In stage and wagon, on mule and horse, riding and trying, sometimes and even afoot, came the rush of madmen. Horses and mules were drowned in the mud holes along the road. Such was the traffic, and such were the floods. The incomers slept 8 in a room, burned oil at $1 a gallon, and ate potatoes at 10 cents apiece. The Grand Central Hotel was a humming real estate exchange, and night and day the occupants of any room could hear through their thin partitions, lots booming to right, left, behind, and in front of them. The labor and capital question was instantly solved, for everybody became a capitalist: carpenter, bricklayer, blacksmith, singing teacher, and preacher. There is no difference between the shrewdest business man and a fool in a boom, for the boom levels all grades of intelligence and produces as distinct a form of insanity as you can find within the walls of an asylum. Lots took wings skyward. Hale bought one for June for $30 and sold it for $1,000. Before the autumn was gone he found himself on the way to ridiculous opulence, and when spring came he had the world in a sling, and if he wished he could toss it playfully at the sun and have it drop back into his hand again. And the boom spread down the valley and into the hills. The police guard had little to do, and over in the mountains the feud miraculously came to a sudden close. So pervasive, indeed, was the spirit of the times that the Honorable Sam Budd actually got old Buck Falin and old Dave Tolliver to sign a truce, agreeing to a complete cessation of hostilities until he carried through a land deal in which both were interested. And after that was concluded, nobody had time, even the Red Fox, for devilry and private vengeance. So busy was everybody picking up the manna which was dropping straight from the clouds. Hale bought all of old Judd's land, formed a stock company, and in the trade gave June a bonus of the stock. Money was plentiful as grains of sand, and the cashier at the bank in the back of the furniture store at the Gap chuckled to his beardless directors as he locked the wooden door on the day before the great land sale. Capital stock paid in $13,000, deposits $300,000. Loans $260,000, interest from 8 to 12%, and beardless though those directors were, that statement made them real. A club was formed, and the like of it was not below Mason and Dixon's line in the way of furniture, periodicals, liquors, and cigars. Poker ceased. It was too tame in competition with this new game of town lots. On the top of High Knob a kingdom was bought. The young bloods of the town would build a lake up there, run a road up, and build a Swiss chalet on the very top for a country club. The booming editor was discharged. A new paper was started, and the ex-editor of a New York daily was got to run it. If anybody wanted anything, he got it from no matter where, nor at what cost. Nor were the arts wholly neglected. One man, who was proud of his voice, thought he would like to take singing lessons. An emissary was sent to Boston to bring back the best teacher he could find. The teacher came with a method of placing the voice by trying to say "come." at the base of the nose and between the eyes. This was with the lips closed. He charged $2 per half hour for his effort, as he had each pupil say it twice for half an hour each day, and for 6 weeks the town was humming like a beehive. At the end of that period the teacher fell ill and went his way with a fat pocketbook, and not a warbling soul had got the chance to open his mouth. The experience dampened nobody. Generosity was limitless. It was equally easy to raise money for a roulette wheel, a cathedral, or an expedition to Africa. And even yet the railroad was miles away, and even yet in February the improvement company had a great land sale. The day before it, competing purchasers had deposited checks aggregating 3 times the sum asked for by the company for the land, so the buyers spent the night organizing a pool to keep down competition, and drawing lots for the privilege of bidding. For fairness, the sale was an auction, and one old farmer who had sold some of the land originally for $100 an acre bought back some of that land for $1,000 a lot. That sale was the climax, and that early. Hale got a warning word from England, but he paid no heed, even though after the sale the boom slackened, poised, and stayed still. For optimism was unquenchable, and another tide would come with another sale in May, and so the spring passed in the same joyous recklessness and same perfect hope. In April the first railroad reached the Gap at last, and families came in rapidly. Money was still plentiful, and right royally was it spent, for was not just as much more coming when the second road arrived in May? Life was easier, too. Supplies came from New York. 8 o'clock dinners were in vogue, and everybody was happy. Every man had 2 or 3 good horses and nothing to do. The place was full of visiting girls. They rode in parties to Pine Knob, and the ring of hoof and the laughter of youth made every dusk resonant with joy. On Popular Hill houses sprang up like magic, and weddings came. The passing stranger was stunned to find out in the wilderness such a spot. Gaiety, prodigal hospitality, a police force of gentlemen, nearly all of whom were college graduates, and a club where poker flourished in the smoke of Havana cigars, and a barrel of whiskey stood in one corner with a faucet waiting for the turn of any hand. And still the foundation of the new hotel was not started, and the coming of the new railroad did not make a marked change. For some reason the May sale was postponed by the improvement company, but what did it matter? Perhaps it was better to wait for the fall, and so the summer went on unchanged. Every man still had a bank account, and in the autumn the boom would come again. At such a time June came home for her vacation, and Bob Berkley came back from college for his. All through the school year Hale had got the best reports of June. His sister's letters were steadily encouraging. June had been very homesick for the mountains and for Hale at first, but the homesickness had quickly worn off, apparently for both. She had studied hard, had become a favorite among the girls, and had held her own among them in a surprising way. But it was on June's musical talent that Hale's sister always laid most stress, and on her voice, which she said was really unusual. June wrote, too, at longer and longer intervals, and in her letters Hale could see the progress she was making, the change in her handwriting, the increasing formality of expression, and the increasing shrewdness of her comments on her fellow pupils, her teachers, and the life about her. She did not write home for a reason Hale knew, though June never mentioned it, because there was no one at home who could read her letters. But she always sent messages to her father and Bub, and to the old miller and old Hun, and Hale faithfully delivered them when he could. From her people, as Hale learned from his sister, only one messenger had come during the year to June, and he came but once. One morning a tall, black-haired, uncouth young man in a slouch hat and a Prince Albert coat had strode up to the school with a big paper box under his arm and asked for June. As he handed the box to the maid at the door, it broke and red apples burst from it and rolled down the steps. There was a shriek of laughter from the girls, and the young man, flushing red as the apples turned without giving his name, and strode back with no little majesty, looking neither to right nor left. Hale knew, and June knew, that the visitor was her cousin Dave, but he never mentioned the incident to him, though as the end of the session drew nigh her letters became more frequent and more full of messages to the people of Lonesome Cove, and she seemed eager to get back home. Over there about this time old Judd concluded suddenly to go West, taking Bud with him, and when Hale wrote, the fact in answer came from June that showed the blot of tears. However, she seemed none the less in a hurry to get back, and when Hale met her at the station he was startled, for she came back in dresses that were below her shoe tops, with her wonderful hair massed in a golden glory on the top of her head, and a little fairy cross dangling at a woman's throat. Her figure had rounded, her voice had softened. She held herself as straight as a young poplar, and she walked the earth as though she had come straight from Olympus. And still, in spite of her new feathers and airs and graces, there was in her eyes and in her laugh and in her moods all the subtle wild charm of the child in Lonesome Cove. It was fairy time for June that summer. Though her father and Bud had gone West, for her stepmother was living with a sister, the cabin in Lonesome Cove was closed, and June stayed at the Gap, not at the Widow Crane's boarding house, but with one of Hale's married friends on Poplar Hill. And always was she, young as she was, one of the merry parties of that happy summer, even at the dances, for the dance, too, June had learned. Moreover, she had picked up the guitar, and many times when Hale had been out in the hills, he would hear her silver clear voice floating out into the moonlight as he made his way toward Poplar Hill, and he would stop under the beeches and listen with ears of growing love to the wonder of it all. For it was he who was the ardent one of the two now. June was no longer the frank, impulsive child who stood at the foot of the beach, doggedly reckless if all the world knew her love for him. She had taken flight to some inner recesses where it was difficult for Hale to follow, and right puzzled he was to discover that he must now win again what an ask she had once so freely given. Bob Berkley, too, had developed amazingly. He no longer said sir to Hale. That was bad form at Harvard. He called him by his first name and looked him in the eye as a man to man. Just as June, Hale observed, no longer seemed in any awe of Miss Ann Saunders, and to have lost all jealousy of her, or of anybody else. So swiftly had her instinct caught her now, she had nothing to fear, and Bob and June seemed mighty pleased with each other, and sometimes Hale, watching them as they galloped past him on horseback, laughing and bantering, felt foolish to think of their perfect fitness, the one for their other, and the incongruity of himself in a relationship that would so naturally be theirs. At one thing he wondered. She had made an extraordinary record at school, and it seemed to him that it was partly through the consciousness that her brain would take care of itself, that she could pay such heed to what hitherto she had no chance to learn: dress, manners, deportment, and speech. Indeed, it was curious that she seemed to lay most stress on the very things to which he, because of his long rough life in the mountains, was growing more and more indifferent. It was quite plain that Bob, with his extreme gallantry of manner, his smart clothes, his high ways, and his unconquerable gaiety, had supplanted him on the pedestal where he had been the year before, just as somebody somewhere, his sister perhaps, had supplanted Miss Ann. Several times, indeed, June had corrected Hale's slips of tongue with mischievous triumph, and once, when he came back late from a long trip in the mountains and walked in to dinner without changing his clothes, Hale saw her look from himself to the immaculate Bob with an unconscious comparison that half amused, half worried him. The truth was, he was building a lovely Frankenstein, and from wondering what he was going to do with it, he was beginning to wonder now what it might some day do with him. And though he sometimes joked with Miss Ann, who had withdrawn now to the level plane of friendship with him, about the transformation that was going on, he worried in a way that did neither his heart nor his brain good. Still, he fought both to little purpose all that summer, and it was not till the time was nigh when June must go away again that he spoke both. For Hale's sister was going to marry, and it was her advice that he should take June to New York, if only for the sake of her music and her voice. That very day June had for the first time seen her cousin Dave. He was on horseback, he had been drinking, and he pulled in and without an answer to her greeting stared her over from head to foot. Coloring angrily, she stared on, and then he spoke thickly and with a sneer. 'Bout fryin' size now, ain't ye? I reckon mebbe if you keep on you'll be good enough fer him in a year or more."
"I'm much obliged for those apples, Dave," said June quietly, and Dave flushed a darker red and sat still, forgetting to renew the old threat that was on his tongue. But his taunt rankled in the girl, rankled more now than when Dave first made it, for she better saw the truth of it, and the hurt was the greater to her unconquerable pride that kept her from betraying the hurt to Dave long ago. And now, when he was making an old wound bleed afresh. But the pain was with her at dinner that night and through the evening. She avoided Hale's eyes, though she knew that he was watching her all the time, and her instinct told her that something was going to happen that night, and what that something was. Hale was the last to go, and when he called to her from the porch, she went out trembling and stood at the head of the steps in the moonlight. "I love you, little girl," he said simply, "and I want you to marry me some day. Will you, June?" She was unsurprised, but she flushed under his hungry eyes, and the little cross throbbed at her throat. "Some day, not now," she thought, and then with equal simplicity, "Yes, Jack, and if you should love somebody else more, you'll tell me right away, won't you, June?" She shrank a little and her eyes fell, but straightway she raised them steadily. "Yes, Jack." "Thank you, little girl. Good night." "Good night, Jack." Hale saw the little shrinking movement she made, and as he went down the hill he thought she seemed to be in a hurry to be alone, and that she caught her breath sharply as he turned away, and brooding, he walked the woods long that night. Only a few days later they started for New York, and with all her dreaming, June had never dreamed that the world could be so large. Mountains, the vast stretches of rolling hills and level land, melted away from her wondering eyes. Towns and cities sank behind them. Swift streams, swollen by freshets, were outstripped and left behind. Darkness came on, and through it they sped on. Once during the night she woke from a troubled dream in her berth, and for a moment she thought she was at home again. They were running through the mountains again, and there they lay in the moonlight, the great calm dark faces that she knew and loved, and she seemed to catch the odor of the earth and feel the cool air on her face. But there was no pang of homesickness now. She was too eager for the world into which she was going. Next morning the air was cooler, the skies lower and grayer. The big city was close at hand. Then came the water, shaking and sparkling in the early light like a great cauldron of quicksilver, and the wonderful Brooklyn Bridge, a ribbon of twinkling lights tossed out through the mist from the mighty city that rose from the mist as from a fantastic dream. Then the picking of the way through the screeching little boats and noiseless big ones and white bird-like floating things that then they disappeared like two tiny grains in a shifting human tide of sand. But Hale was happy now, for on the trip June had come back to herself and to him once more, and now awed but unafraid, eager, bubbling, up-looking, full of quaint questions about everything she saw. She was once more sitting with an affectionate reverence at his feet. When he left her in a great low house that fronted on the majestic Hudson, June clung to him with tears and of her own accord kissed him for the first time since she had torn her little playhouse to pieces at the foot of the beach down in the mountains far away. And Hale went back with peace in his heart, but to trouble in the hills. Not suddenly did the boom drop down there, not like a falling star, but on the wings of hope, wings that ever fluttering upward, yet sank inexorably and slowly closed. The first crash came over the waters when certain big men over there went to pieces, men on whose shoulders rested the colossal figures of progress that the English were carving from the hills at Cumberland Gap. Still nobody saw why a hurt to the lion should make the eagle soar, and so the American spirit at the other gaps and all up the Virginia valleys and skirt of the Cumberland held faithful and dauntless for a while. But in time, as the huge steel plants grew noiseless and the flaming throats of the furnaces were throttled, a sympathetic fire of dissolution spread slowly north and south, and it was plain, only to the wise outsider as merely a matter of time until all up and down the Cumberland the fox and the coon and the quail could come back to their old homes on corner lots, marked each by a pathetic little whitewashed post, a tombstone, over the graves of a myriad of buried human hopes. But it was the gap where Hale was that died last and hardest, and of the brave spirits there, his was the last and hardest to die. In the autumn, while June was in New York, the signs were sure, but every soul refused to see them. Slowly, however, the vexed question of labor and capital was born again, for slowly each local capitalist went slowly back to his own trade, the blacksmith to his forge, but the carpenter not to his plane, nor the mason to his brick. There was no more building going on. The engineer took up his transit, the preacher politician and was oftener in his pulpit, and the singing teacher started on his round of raucous do mi so la dos through the mountains again. It was curious to see how each man slowly, reluctantly, and perforce sank back again to his old occupation, and the town, with the luxuries of electricity, waterworks, bathtubs, and a street railway, was having a hard fight for the plain necessities of life. The following spring, notes for the second payment on the lots that had been bought at the great land sale fell due, but very few were paid. As no suits were brought by the company, however, hope did not quite die. June did not come home for the summer, and Hale did not encourage her to come. She visited some of her schoolmates in the North and took a trip west to see her father, who had gone out there again and bought a farm. In the early autumn, Devil Judd came back to the mountains and announced his intention to leave them for good. But that autumn the effects of the dead boom became perceptible in the hills. There were no coal lands bought, logging ceased, the factories were idle once more, moonshine stills flourished. Quarreling started, and at the county seat one court date Devil Judd whipped 3 Falins with his bare fist. In the early spring a Tolliver was shot from ambush, and old Judd was so furious at the outrage that he openly announced that he would stay at home until he had settled the old scores for good. For that, as the summer came on, matters between the Falins and the Tollivers were worse than they had been for years, and everybody knew that with old Judd at the head of his clan, the fight would be fought to the finish. At the Gap, one institution only had suffered in spirit not at all. That was the volunteer police guard. Indeed, as the excitement of the boom had died down, the members of that force, as a vent for their energies, went with more enthusiasm than ever into their work. Local lawlessness had been subdued by this time. The guard had been extending its work into the hills, and it was only a question of time until it must take a part in the Falin-Tolliver troubles. Indeed, that time, Hale believed, was not far away, for election day was at hand, and always on that day the feudalists came to the Gap in a search for trouble. Meanwhile, not long afterward, there was a pitched battle between the factions at the county seat, and several of each would fight no more. Next day a Falin whistled a bullet through Devil Judd's beard from ambush, and it was at such a crisis of all the warring elements in her mountain life that June's school days were coming to a close. Hale had had a frank talk with old Judd, and the old man agreed that the two had best be married at once and live at the Gap until things were quietest in the mountains, though the old man still clung to his resolution to go west for good when he was done with the Falins. At such a time, then, June was coming home. End of chapter 20. #21 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 21. Hale was beyond Black Mountain when her letter reached him. His work over there had to be finished, and so he kept in his saddle the greater part of 2 days and nights, and on the 3rd day he rode his big black horse 40 miles in little more than half a day, that he might meet her at the train. The last 2 years had wrought their change on him.
Deterioration is easy in the hills. Superficial deterioration in habits, manners, personal appearance, and the practices of all the little niceties of life. The morning bath is impossible because of the crowded domestic conditions of a mountain cabin, and, if possible, might, if practised, excite wonder and comment, if not vague suspicion. Sleeping garments are practically barred for the same reason. Shaving becomes a rare luxury. A lost toothbrush may not be replaced for a month. In time one may bring himself to eat with a knife for the reason that it is hard for a hungry man to feed himself with a fork that has but two tines. The fingertips cease to be the culminating standard of the gentleman. It is hard to keep a supply of fresh linen when one is constantly in the saddle, and a constant weariness of body and a ravenous appetite make a man indifferent to things like a bad bed and worse food, particularly as he must philosophically put up with them anyhow. Of all these things the man himself may be quite unconscious, and yet they affect him more deeply than he knows, and show to a woman even in his voice, his walk, his mouth. Everywhere, save in the eyes, which change only in severity or in kindliness, or when there has been some serious breakdown of soul or character within. And the woman will not look to his eyes for the truth, which makes its way slowly, particularly when the woman is striven for the very things that the man has so recklessly let go. She would never suffer herself to let down in such a way, and she does not understand how a man can. Hale's life, since his college doors had closed behind him, had always been a rough one. He had dropped from civilization and gone back into it many times, and each time he dropped the deeper, and for that reason had he come back into his own life each time with more difficulty and with more indifference. The last had been his roughest year, and he had sunk a little more deeply just at the time when June had been pluming herself for flight from such depths forever. Moreover, Hale had been dominant in every matter that his hand or his brain had touched. His habit had been to say, "Do this," and it was done. Though he was no longer acting captain of the police guard, he always acted as captain whenever he was on hand, and always he was the undisputed leader in all questions of business, politics, or the maintenance of law and order. The success he had forged had hardened and strengthened his mouth, steeled his eyes, and made him more masterful in manner, speech, and point of view, and naturally had added nothing to his gentleness, his unselfishness, his refinement, or the nice consideration of little things on which women lay such stress. It was an hour by sun when he clattered through the gap and pushed his tired black horse into a gallop across the valley toward the town. He saw the smoke of the Little Dummy, and as he thundered over the bridge at the North Fork, he saw that it was just about to pull out, and he waved his hat and shouted imperiously for it to wait. With his hand on the bell-rope, the conductor, autocrat that he too was, did wait, and Hale threw his reins to the man who was nearest, hardly seeing who he was, and climbed aboard. He wore a slouched hat spotted by contact with the roof of the mines which he had hastily visited on his way through Lonesome Cove. The growth of 3 days' beard was on his face. He wore a gray woolen shirt, and a blue handkerchief, none too clean, was loosely tied about his sun-scorched column of a neck. He was spotted with mud from his waist to the soles of his rough riding boots, and his hands were rough and grimy. But his eye was bright and keen, and his heart thumped eagerly. Again it was the middle of June, and the town was a naked island in a sea of leaves, whose breakers literally had run mountain high and stopped for all time, motionless. Purple lights, thick as mist, veiled Powell's Mountain. Below, the valley was still flooded with yellow sunlight which lay along the mountain sides and was streaked here and there with the long shadow of a deep ravine. The beech trunks on Imboden Hill gleamed in it like little white bodies scantily draped with green, and the yawning gap held the yellow light as a bowl holds wine. He had long ago come to look upon the hills merely as storehouses for iron and coal, put there for his special purpose, but now the long submerged sense of the beauty of it all stirred within him again, for June was the incarnate spirit of it all, and June was coming back to those mountains and to him. And June had seen the change in Hale. The first year he had come often to New York to see her, and they had gone to the theater and the opera, and June was pleased to play the part of heroine in what was such a real romance to the other girls in school, and she was proud of Hale. But each time he came he seemed less interested in the diversions that meant so much to her, more absorbed in his affairs in the mountains, and less particular about his looks. His visits came at longer intervals. With each visit he stayed less long, and each time he seemed more eager to get away. She had been shy about appearing before him for the first time in evening dress, and when he entered the drawing-room she stood under a chandelier in blushing and resplendent confusion. But he seemed not to recognize that he had never seen her that way before, and for another reason June remained confused, disappointed, and hurt. For he was not only unobserving and seemingly unappreciative, but he was more silent than ever that night, and he looked gloomy. But if he had grown accustomed to her beauty, there were others who had not. The smart, dapper college youths gathered about her like bees around a flower, a triumphant fact to which he also seemed indifferent. Moreover, he was not in evening clothes that night, and she did not know whether he had forgotten or was indifferent to them. And the contrast that he was made her that night almost ashamed of him. She never guessed what the matter was, for Hale kept his troubles to himself. He was always gentle and kind. He was as lavish with her as though he were a king, and she was as lavish and prodigally generous as though she were a princess. There seemed no limit to the wizard income from the investments that Hale had made for her when, as he said, he sold a part of her stock in the Lonesome Cove mine, and what she wanted Hale always sent her without question. Only as the end was coming on at the Gap, he wrote once to know if a certain amount would carry her through until she was ready to come home. But even that question aroused no suspicion in the thoughtless June. And then, that last year, he had come no more. Always he was too busy. Not even on her triumphal night at the end of the session was he there, when she had stood before the guests and patrons of the school like a goddess, and had thrilled them into startling applause, her teachers into open glowing pride, and the other girls into bright-eyed envy, and herself into still another new world. Now she was going home, and she was glad to go. She had awakened that morning with the keen air of the mountain in her nostrils, the air she had breathed in when she was born, and her eyes shone happily when she saw through her window the love-blue hills along which raced the train. They were only a little way from the town where she must change, the porter said. She had overslept, and she had no time even to wash her face and hands, and that worried her a good deal. The porter nearly lost his equilibrium when she gave him $50, for women are not profuse in the ways of tipping, and instead of putting her bag down on the station platform, he held it in his hand, waiting to do her further service. At the head of the steps she searched about for Hale, and her lovely face looked vexed and a little hurt when she did not see him. "Hotel, miss?" said the porter. "Yes, please, Harvey," she called. An astonished black man sprang from the line of calling hotel porters and took her bag. Then every tooth in his head flashed. "Lordy, Miss June, I never knowed you at all." June smiled in the tribute she was looking for. "Have you seen Mr. Hale?" "No'm. Mr. Hale ain't been here for months, 6 months. I reckon he ain't in the country now. I ain't heard nothin' about him for a long time." June knew better than that, but she said nothing. She would rather have had even Harvey think that he was away. So she hurried to the hotel. She would have 4 hours to wait, and asked for the one room that had a bath attached, the room to which Hale had sent her when she had passed through on her way to New York. She almost winced when she looked in the mirror and saw the smoke stains about her pretty throat and ears, and she wondered if anybody could have noticed them on her way from the train. Her hands, too, were dreadful to look at, and she hurried to take off her things. In an hour she emerged, freshened, immaculate from the crown of her lovely hair to her smartly booted feet, and at once she went downstairs. She heard the man whom she passed stop at the head of them and turn to look down at her, and she saw necks craned within the hotel office when she passed the door.
On the street not a man and hardly a woman failed to look at her with wonder and open admiration, for she was an apparition in that little town, and it all pleased her so much that she became flushed and conscious and felt like a queen who, unknown, moved among her subjects and blessed them just with her gracious presence. For she was unknown, even by several people whom she knew, and that too pleased her, to have blossomed beyond their ken. She was like a meteor coming back to dazzle the very world from which it had flown for a while into space. When she went into the dining room for the midday dinner, there was a movement in almost every part of the room, as though there were many there who were on the lookout for her entrance. The head waiter lost his imperturbable majesty for a moment in surprise at the vision, and then with a lordly yet obsequious wave of his hand led her to a table over in a corner where no one was sitting. 4 young men came in rather boisterously and made for her table. She lifted her calm eyes at them so haughtily that the one in front halted with sudden embarrassment, and they all swerved to another table from which they stared at her surreptitiously. Perhaps she was mistaken for the comic opera star whose brilliant picture she had seen on the billboard in front of the opera house. Well, she had the voice, and she might have been, and she might yet be, and if she were, this would be the distinction that would be shown her. And still, as it was, she was greatly pleased. At 4 o'clock she started for the hills. In half an hour she was dropping down a winding ravine along a rock-lashing stream, with those hills so close to the car on either side that only now and then could she see the tops of them. Through the window the keen air came from the very lungs of them, frightened with the coolness of shadows, the scent of damp earth, and the faint fragrance of wild flowers, and her soul leaped to meet them. The mountain sides were showered with pink and white laurel, she used to call the ivy, and the rhododendrons, she used to call them laurel, were just beginning to blossom. They were her old and fast friends. Mountain shadow, the wet earth and its pure breath, and tree plant and flower, she had not forgotten them, and it was good to come back to them. Once she saw an overshot water-wheel on the bank of a rushing little stream, and she thought of Uncle Billy. She smiled, and the smile stopped short. She was going back to other things as well. The train had creaked by a log cabin set in the hillside, and then past another and another, and always there were 2 or 3 ragged children in the door, and a haggard, unkempt woman peering over their shoulders. How lonely those cabins looked! How desolate the life they suggested to her now. The first station she came to after the train had wound down the long ravine to the valley level again was crowded with mountaineers. There a wedding party got aboard with a great deal of laughter, chaffing, and noise, and all 3 went on within and without the train while it was waiting. A sudden thought stunned her like a lightning stroke. They were her people, out there on the platform and inside the car. Ahead, those rough men in slouch hats, jeans, and cowhide boots, their mouths stained with tobacco juice, their cheeks and eyes on fire with moonshine, and those women in poke bonnets with their sad, worn, patient faces, on which the sympathetic good cheer and joy of the moment sat so strangely. She noticed their rough shoes, and their homespun gowns that made their figures all alike and shapeless, with a vivid awakening of early memories. She might have been one of those narrow-life girls outside, or that bride within, had it not been for Jack Hale. She finished the name in her own mind that she was conscious that she had. Ah, well, that was a long time ago, and she was nothing but a child, and she had thrown herself at his head. Perhaps it was different with him now, and if it was, she would give him the chance to withdraw from everything. It would be right and fair, and then life was so full for her now. She was dependent on nobody, on nothing. A rainbow spanned the heavens above her, and the other end of it was not in the hills, but one end was, and to that end she was on her way. She was going to just such people as she had seen at the station. Her father and her kinsmen were just such men. Her stepmother and kinswomen were just such women. Her home was little more than just such a cabin as the desolate ones that stirred her pity when she swept by them. She thought of how she felt when she had first gone to Lonesome Cove after a few months at the Gap, and she shuddered to think how she would feel now. She was getting restless by this time, and aimlessly she got up and walked to the front of the car and back again to her seat, hardly noticing that the other occupants were staring at her with some wonder. She sat down for a few minutes, and then she went to the rear and stood outside on the platform, clutching a brass rod on the railing and looking back on the dropping darkness, in which the hills seemed to be rushing together far behind as the train crashed on with its wake of sparklit rolling smoke. A cinder stung her face, and when she lifted her hand to the spot, she saw that her glove was black with grime. With a little shiver of disgust, she went back to her seat, and with her face to the blackness rushing past her window, she sat brooding. Why had Hale not met her? He had said he would, and she had written him when she was coming, and had telegraphed him at the station in New York when she started. Perhaps he had changed. She recalled that even his letters had grown less frequent, shorter, more hurried the past year. Well, he should have his chance. Always, however, her mind kept going back to the people at the station and to her people in the mountains. They were the same, she kept repeating to herself, the very same, and she was one of them. And always she kept thinking of her first trip to Lonesome Cove after her awakening, and of what her next would be. That first time Hale had made her go back, as she had left, in homespun, sunbonnet, and brogans. There was the same reason why she should go back that way now as then. Would Hale insist that she should now? She almost laughed aloud at the thought. She knew that she would refuse, and she knew that his reason would not appeal to her now. She no longer cared for what her neighbors and kinspeople might think and say. The porter paused at her seat. "How much longer is it?" she asked. "Half an hour, miss." June went to wash her face and hands, and when she came back to her seat, a great glare shone through the windows on the other side of the car. It was a furnace. A run was on, and she could see the streams of white molten metal racing down the narrow channels of sand to their narrow beds on either side. The whistle shrieked ahead for the Gap, and she nerved herself with a prophetic sense of vague trouble at hand. At the station, Hale had paced the platform. He looked at his watch to see whether he might have time to run to the furnace half a mile away and board the train there. He thought he had, and he was about to start when the shriek of the incoming engine rose beyond the low hills in Wildcat Valley, echoed along Powell's Mountain, and broke against the wrinkled breast of the Cumberland. On it came, and in plain sight it stopped suddenly to take water, and Hale cursed it silently and recalled viciously that when he was in a hurry to arrive anywhere, the water tower was always on the wrong side of the station. He got so restless that he started for it on a run, and he had gone hardly 50 yards before the train came on again, and he had to run back to beat it to the station, where he sprang to the steps of the Pullman before it stopped, pushing the porter aside to find himself checked by the crowded passengers at the door. June was not among them, and straightway he ran for the rear of the car. June had risen. The other occupants of the car had crowded forward, and she was the last of them. She had stood, during an irritating wait, at the water tower, and now she moved slowly forward again. She heard the hurry of feet behind her, and she turned to look into the eager, wondering eyes of John Hale. "June!" he cried in amazement, but his face lighted with joy, and he impulsively stretched out his arms as though he meant to take her in them, but as suddenly he dropped them before the startled look in her eyes, which, with one swift glance, searched him from head to foot. They shook hands almost gravely. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 22. June sat in the little dummy, the focus of curious eyes, while Hale was busy seeing that her baggage was got aboard. The checks that she gave him jingled in his hands like a bunch of keys, and he could hardly help grinning when he saw the huge trunks and the smart bags that were tumbled from the baggage car, all marked with her initials. There had been days when he had laid considerable emphasis on pieces like those, and when he thought of them overwhelming with opulent suggestions that debt-stricken little town, and later piled incongruously on the porch of the cabin on Lonesome Cove, he could have laughed aloud but for a nameless something that was gnawing savagely at his heart. He felt almost shy when he went back into the car, and though June greeted him with a smile, her immaculate daintiness made him unconsciously sit quite far away from her. The little fairy cross was still at her throat, but a tiny diamond gleamed from each end of it, and from the center, as from a tiny heart, pulsated the light of a little blood-red ruby. To him it meant the loss of June's simplicity, and was the symbol of her new estate. But he smiled and forced himself into hearty cheerfulness of manner, and asked her questions about her trip. But June answered in halting monosyllables, and talk was not easy between them. All the while he was watching her closely, and not a movement of her eye, ear, mouth, or hand, not an inflection of her voice escaped him. He saw her sweep the car and its occupants with a glance, and he saw the results of that glance in her face, and the down-dropping of her eyes to the dainty point of one boot. He saw her beautiful mouth close suddenly tight, and her thin nostrils quiver disdainfully when a swirl of black smoke, heavy with cinders, came in with an entering passenger through the front door of the car. Two half-drunken men were laughing boisterously near that door, and even her ears seemed trying to shut out their half-smothered rough talk. The car started with a bump that swayed her toward him, and when she caught the seat with one hand, it checked as suddenly, throwing her the other way, and then with a leap it sprang ahead again, giving a nagging snap to her head. Her whole face grew red with vexation and shrinking distaste, and all the while, when the little train steadied into its creaking, puffing, jostling way, one gloved hand on the chased silver handle of her smart little umbrella kept nervously swaying it to and fro on its steel-shod point, until she saw that the point was in a tiny pool of tobacco juice, and then she laid it across her lap with shuddering swiftness. At first Hale thought that she had shrunk from kissing him in the car because other people were around. He knew better now. At that moment he was as rough and dirty as the chain carrier opposite him, who was just in from a surveying expedition in the mountains, as the sooty brakeman who came through to gather up the fares, as one of those good-natured, profane inebriates up in the corner. No, it was not publicity. She had shrunk from him as was shrinking now from black smoke, rough men, the shaking of the train, the little pool of tobacco juice at her feet. The truth began to glimmer through his brain. He understood even when she leaned forward suddenly to look into the mouth of the gap that was now dark with shadows. Through that gap lay her way, and she thought him now more a part of what was beyond than she who had been born of it was, and dazed by the thought, he wondered if he might not really be. At once he straightened in his seat, and his mind made up, as he always made it up, swiftly. He had not explained why he had not met her that morning, nor had he apologized for his rough garb, because he was so glad to see her and because there were so many other things he wanted to say. And when he saw her, conscious and resentful, perhaps, that he had not done those things at once, he deliberately declined to do them now. He became silent, but he grew more courteous, more thoughtful, watchful. She was very tired, poor child. There were deep shadows under her eyes which looked weary and almost mournful. So when with a clanging of the engine bell they stopped at the brilliantly lit hotel, he led her at once upstairs to the parlor, and from there sent her up to her room, which was ready for her. "You must get a good sleep," he said kindly, and with his usual firmness that was wont to preclude argument. "You are worn to death. I'll have your supper sent to your room." The girl felt a subtle change in his manner, and her lip quivered, for a vague reason that neither knew, but without a word she obeyed him like a child. He did not try again to kiss her. He merely took her hand, placed his left over it, and with a gentle pressure said, "Good night, little girl." "Good night," she faltered. Resolutely, relentlessly first, Hale cast up his accounts, liabilities, resources that night, to see what, under the least favorable outcome, the balance left to him would be. Nearly all was gone. His securities were already sold. His lots would not bring at public sale one half of the deferred payments yet to be made on them, and if the company brought suit, as it was threatening to do, he would be left fathoms deep in debt. The branch railroad had not come up the river toward Lonesome Cove, and now he meant to build barges and float his cannel coal down to the main line, for his sole hope was in the mine in Lonesome Cove. The means that he could command were meager, but they would carry his purpose with June for a year at least, and then, who knew? He might, through that mine, be on his feet again. The little town was dark and asleep when he stepped into the cool night air and made his way past the old schoolhouse and up Imboden Hill. He could see, all shining silver in the moonlight, the still crest of the big beech, at the blessed roots of which his lips had met June's on the first kiss that had passed between them. On he went through the shadowy aisle that the path made between other beech trunks, harnessed by the moonlight, with silver armor and motionless as sentinels on watch till dawn. Out past the amphitheater of darkness from which the dead trees tossed out their crooked arms, as though voicing silently now his own soul's torment, and then on to the point of the spur of the foothills, where, with the mighty mountains encircling him and the world, a dreamland lighted only by stars, he stripped his soul before the maker of it and of him, and fought his fight out alone. His was the responsibility for all, his alone. No one else was to blame. June not at all. He had taken her from her own life, had swerved her from the way to which God pointed when she was born. He had given her everything she wanted, and allowed her to do what she pleased, and had let her think that, through his miraculous handling of her resources, she was doing it all herself, and the result was natural. For the past 2 years he had been harassed with debt, racked with worries, writhing this way and that, concerned only with the soul-tormenting catastrophe that had overtaken him. About all else he had grown careless. He had not been to see her the last year. He had written seldom, and it appalled him to look back now on his own self-absorption, and to think how he must have appeared to June. And he had gone on in that self-absorption to the very end. He had got his license to marry, had asked Uncle Billy, who was magistrate as well as miller, to marry them, and, a rough mountaineer himself to the outward eye, he had appeared to lead a child like a lamb to the sacrifice, and had found a woman with a mind, heart, and purpose of her own. It was all his work. He had sent her away to fit her for his station in life, to make her fit to marry him. She had risen above, and now he was not fit to marry her. That was the brutal truth, a truth that was enough to make a wise man laugh or a fool weep. And Hale did neither. He simply went on working to make out how he could best discharge the obligations that he had voluntarily, willingly, gladly, selfishly even assumed. In his mind he treated conditions only as he saw and felt them and believed them at that moment true, and into the problem he went no deeper than to find his simple duty, and that, while the morning stars were sinking, he found. And it was a duty the harder to find because everything had reawakened within him, and the starting point of that awakening was the proud glow in Uncle Willie's kind old face when he knew the part he was to play in the happiness of Hale and June. All the way over the mountain that day his heart had gathered fuel from memories at the big pine, and down the mountain and through the gap, to be set aflame by the yellow sunlight in the valley and the throbbing life in everything that was alive. For the month was June, and the spirit of that month was on her way back to him. So when he rose now with back-thrown head, he stretched his arms suddenly out towards those far-seeing stars, and as suddenly dropped them with an angry shake of his head and one quick gritting of his teeth. that such a thought should have mastered him even for one swift second. The thought of how lonesome would be the trail that would be his to follow after that day. End of chapter 22. Three of the Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 23. June, tired though she was, tossed restlessly that night. The one look she had seen in Hale's face when she met him in the car told her the truth as far as he was concerned. He was unchanged. She could give him no chance to withdraw from their long understanding, for it was plain to her quick instinct that he wanted none, and so she had asked him no question about his failure to meet her, for she knew now that his reason, no matter what, was good. He had startled her in the car, for her mind was heavy with memories of the poor little cabins she had passed on the train, the mountain men and women in the wedding party, and Hale himself was to the eyes so much like one of them, had so startled her that, though she knew his instinct, too, was at work, she could not gather herself together to combat her own feelings, for every little happening in the dummy but drew her back to her previous train of painful thought, and in that helplessness she had told Hale good night. She remembered now how she had looked upon Lonesome Cove after she went to the Gap, how she had looked upon the Gap after her year in the Bluegrass, and how she looked back even on the first big city she had seen there from the lofty vantage ground of New York. What was the use of it all? Why laboriously climb a hill merely to see and yearn for things that you cannot have, if you must go back and live in the hollow again? Well, she thought rebelliously, she would not go back to the hollow again, that was all. She knew what was coming, and her cousin Dave's perpetual sneer sprang suddenly from the past to cut through her again, and the old pride rose within her once more. She was good enough now for Hale. Oh, yes, she thought bitterly, good enough now. And then, remembering his lifelong kindness, and thinking what she might have been but for him, she burst into tears at the unworthiness of her own thought. What should she do? What should she do? Repeating that question over and over again, she fell toward morning into troubled sleep. She did not wake until nearly noon, for already she had formed the habit of sleeping late at least for that part of the world, and she was glad when the boy brought her word that Mr. Hale had been called up the valley and would not be back until the afternoon. She dreaded to meet him, for she knew that he had seen the trouble within her, and she knew he was not the kind of man to let matters drag vaguely, if they could be cleared up and settled by open frankness of discussion, no matter how blunt he must be. She had to wait until midday dinner time to get something to eat, so she lay abed, picked a breakfast from the menu, which was spotted, dirty, and meager in offerings, and had it brought to her room. Early in the afternoon she issued forth into the sunlight and started toward Imboden Hill. It was very beautiful and soul-comforting, the warm air, the luxuriantly wooded hills, with their shades of green that told her where poplar and oak and beech and maple grew, the delicate haze of blue that overlay them and deepened as her eyes followed the still mountain piles northeastward to meet the big range that shut her in from the outer world. The changes had been many. One part of the town had been wiped out by fire, and a few buildings of stone had risen up. On the streets she saw strange faces, but now and then she stopped to shake hands with somebody whom she knew, and who recognized her, always with surprise, and spoke but few words. And then, as she thought, with some embarrassment, half unconsciously, she turned toward the old mill. There it was, dusty and gray, and the dripping old wheel creaked with its weight of shining water, and the muffled roar of the unseen dam started an answering stream of memories surging within her. She could see the window of her room in the old brick boarding house, and as she passed the gate She almost stopped to go in, but the face of a strange man who stood in the door with a proprietary air deterred her. There was Hale's little frame cottage, and his name, half washed out, was over the wing that was still his office. Past that she went with a passing temptation to look within and toward the old schoolhouse. A massive new one was half built of gray stone to the left, but the old one, with its shingles on the outside that had once caused her such wonder, still lay warm in the sun, but closed and deserted. There was the playground where she had been caught in Ring Around the Rosy, and Hale and that girl teacher had heard her confession. She flushed again when she thought of that day, but the flush was now for another reason. Over the roof of the schoolhouse she could see the beech tree where she had built her playhouse, and memory led her from the path toward it. She had not climbed a hill for a long time, and she was panting when she reached it. There was the scattered playhouse. It might have lain there untouched for a quarter of a century, just as her angry feet had kicked it to pieces. On a root of the beech she sat down, and the broad rim of her hat scratched the trunk of it and annoyed her, so she took it off and leaned her head against the tree, looking up into the underworld of the leaves, through which a sunbeam filtered here and there, one striking her hair, which had darkened to the duller gold, striking it eagerly, unerringly, as though it had started for just such a shining mark. Below her was outspread the little town, the straggling, wretched little town, crude, lonely, lifeless. She could not be happy in Lonesome Cove after she had known the Gap, and now her horizons had so broadened that she felt now toward the Gap and its people as she had then felt toward the mountaineers, for the standards of living in the Cove, so it seemed, were no farther below the standards in the Gap than they in turn were lower than the new standards to which she had adapted herself while away. Indeed, even that bluegrass world where she had spent a year was too narrow now for her vaulting ambition, and with that thought she looked down again on the little town, a lonely island in a sea of mountains, and as far from the world for which she had been training herself as though it were in mid-ocean. Live down there? She shuddered at the thought, and straightway was very miserable. The clear piping of a wood thrush rose far away. A tear started between her half-closed lashes, and she might have gone to weeping silently had her ear not caught the sound of something moving below her. Someone was coming that way, so she brushed her eyes swiftly with her handkerchief and stood upright against the tree. And there again Hale found her, tense, upright, bareheaded again, and her hands behind her. Only her face was not uplifted and dreaming. It was turned toward him, unstartled and expectant. He stopped below her and leaned one shoulder against a tree. "I saw you pass the office," he said, "and I thought I should find you here." His eyes dropped to the scattered playhouse of long ago, and a faint smile that was full of submerged sadness passed over his face. It was his playhouse, after all, that she had kicked to pieces. But he did not mention it, nor her attitude, nor did he try in any way to arouse her memories of that other time at this same place. "I want to talk with you, June, and I want to talk now." "Yes, Jack," she said tremulously. For a moment he stood in silence, his face half turned, his teeth hard on his indrawn lip, thinking. There was nothing of the mountaineer about him now. He was clean-shaven and dressed with care. June saw that. But he looked quite old. His face seemed harried with worries and ravaged by suffering, and June had suddenly to swallow a quick surging of pity for him. He spoke slowly and without looking at her. "June, if it hadn't been for me, you would be over in Lonesome Cove and happily married by this time, or at least contented with your life, for you wouldn't have known any other." "I don't know, Jack. I took you out, and it rests with you whether I shall be sorry I did. Sorry wholly on your account, I mean," he said hastily. She knew what he meant, and she said nothing. She only turned her head away slightly, with her eyes upturned a little toward the leaves that were shaking like her own heart. "I think I see it all very clearly. he went on in a low and perfectly even voice. "You can't be happy over there now. You can't be happy over here now. You've got other wishes, ambitions, dreams now, and I want you to realize them. I want to help you realize them. All I can, that's all." "Jack," she helplessly, protestingly spoke his name in a whisper, but that was all she could do, and he went on. "It isn't so strange. What is strange is that I didn't foresee it all. But if I had," he added firmly, "I'd have done it just the same, unless by doing it I've really done you more harm than good." "No, no, Jack." "I came into your world. You went into mine. What I had grown indifferent about, you grew to care about. You grew sensitive, while I was growing callous to certain—" He was about to say surface things, but he checked himself. "Certain things in life that mean more to a woman than to a man. I would not have married you as you were. I've got to be honest now. At least I thought it necessary that you should be otherwise. And now you've gone beyond me, and now you do not want to marry me as I am, and it is all very natural and very just." Very slowly her head had dropped until her chin rested hard above the little jeweled cross on her breast. "You must tell me if I'm wrong. You don't love me now well enough to be happy with me here." He waved one hand toward the straggling little town below them and then toward the lonely mountains. "I did not know that we would have to live here, but I know it now." He checked himself, and afterward she recalled the tone of those last words, but then they had no especial significance. "Am I wrong?" he repeated, and then he said hurriedly, for her face was so piteous, "No, you needn't give yourself the pain of saying it in words. I want you to know that I understand that there's nothing in the world I blame you for. Nothing, nothing. If there is any blame at all, it rests on me alone." She broke toward him with a cry then. "Jack, no, Jack," she said brokenly, and she caught his hand in both her own and tried to raise it to her lips, but he held her back, and she put her face on his breast and sobbed broken-heartedly. He waited for the paroxysm to pass, stroking her hair gently. "You mustn't feel that way, little girl. You can't help it. I can't help it. And these things happen all the time, everywhere. You don't have to stay here. You can go away and study, and when I can, I'll come to see you and cheer you up. And when you are a great singer, I'll send you flowers and be so proud of you. And I'll say to myself, I helped do that. Dry your eyes now. You must go back to the hotel. Your father will be there by this time, and you'll have to be starting home pretty soon." Like a child she obeyed him, but she was so weak and trembling that he put his arm about her to help her down the hill. At the edge of the wood she stopped and turned full toward him. "You are so good," she said tremulously, "so good. Why, you haven't even asked me if there was another—" Hale interrupted her, shaking his head. "If there is, I don't want to know." "But there isn't, there isn't," she cried. "I don't know what the matter is with me. I hate—" The tears started again, and again she was on the point of breaking down, but Hale checked her. Now," he said soothingly, "you mustn't. No, it's all right. You mustn't." Her anger at herself helped now. "Why, I stood like a silly fool, tongue-tied. I wanted to say so much. You don't need to," Hale said gently. "I understand it all. I understand." "I believe you do," she said with a sob. "Better than I do." "Well, all right, little girl. Come on." They issued forth into the sunlight, and Hale walked rapidly. The strain was getting too much for him, and he was anxious to be alone. Without a word more they passed the old schoolhouse, a massive new one, and went on in silence down the street. Hitched to a post near the hotel were two gaunt horses with drooping heads, and on one of them was a side saddle. Sitting on the steps of the hotel with a pipe in his mouth was the mighty figure of Devil Judd Tolliver. He saw them coming, at least he saw Hale coming, and That far away Hale saw his bushy eyebrows lift in wonder at June. A moment later he rose to his great height without a word. "Dad," said June in a trembling voice, "don't you know me?" The old man stared at her silently, and a doubtful smile played about his bearded lips. "Hardly, but I reckon it's June." She knew that the world to which Hale belonged would expect her to kiss him, and she made a movement as though she would, but the habit of a lifetime is not broken so easily. She held out her hand, and with the other patted him on the arm as she looked up into his face. "Time to be goin', June, if we want to get home afore dark." "All right, Dad." The old man turned to his horse. "Hurry up, little gal." In a few minutes they were ready, and the girl looked long into Hale's face when he took her hand. "Are you coming over soon?" "Just as soon as I can." Her lips trembled. "Good-bye," she faltered. "Good-bye, June," said Hale. From the steps he watched them, the giant father slouching in his saddle and the trim figure of the now sadly misplaced girl erect on the awkward pacing mountain beast, as incourageous, the two, as a fairy on some prehistoric monster. A horseman was coming up the street behind him, and a voice called, "Who's that?" Hale turned. It was the Honorable Samuel Budd coming home from court. "June Tolliver, June Taliferno," corrected the Honorable Sam with emphasis. "The same." The Honorable Sam silently followed the pair for a moment through his big goggles. "What do you think of my theory of the latent possibilities of the mountaineer now?" "I think I know how true it is better than you do," said Hale calmly, and with a grunt the Honorable Sam rode on. Hale watched them as they rode across the plateau, watched them until the Gap swallowed them up, and his heart ached for June. Then he went to his room, and there, stretched out on his bed, and with his hands clenched behind his head, he lay staring upward. Devil Judd Tolliver had lost none of his taciturnity. Stolidly, silently, he went ahead, as is the custom of lordly man in the mountains, horseback or afoot, asking no question, answering June's in the fewest words possible. Uncle Billy, the miller, had been complaining a good deal that spring, and old Hon had rheumatism. Uncle Billy's old maid sister, who lived in Devil's Fork, had been cooking for him at home since the last taking to bed of June's stepmother. Bub had growed up like a hickory sapling. Her cousin Loretta hadn't married, and some folks allowed she'd run away some day with that young buck Falin. Her cousin Dave had gone off to school that year, had come back a month before, and had been shot through the shoulder. He was in Lonesome Cove now. This fact was mentioned in the same matter-of-fact way as the other happenings. Hale had been raising Cain in Lonesome Cove, a-cutting things down and tearing 'em up and playin' hell generally. The feud had broken out again, and maybe June couldn't stay at home long. He didn't want her there with the fighting going on, whereat June's heart gave a start of gladness that the way would be easy for her to leave when she wished to leave. Things over at the Gap was a-goin' to perdition, the old man had been told, while he was waiting for June and Hale that day, and Hale not only lost a lot of money, but if things didn't take a rise he would be left head over heels in debt if that mine over in Lonesome Cove didn't pull him out. They were approaching the big Pine now, and June was beginning to ache and get sore from the climb. So Hale was in trouble. That was what he meant when he said that though she could leave the mountains when she pleased, he must stay there, perhaps for good. "I'm mighty glad you came home, gal," said the old man, "and that you're goin' to put an end to all this spendin' of so much money. Jack says you got some money left, but I don't understand it. He says he made an investment for ye to triple the money. I hain't never asked him no questions. It was betwixt you and him, and that 'twa'n't none of my business long as you and him ever gettin' to marry. He said you was goin' to marry him this summer, and I wish you'd get tied up right away whilst I'm livin', for I don't know when a Winchester might take me off, and I'd die a sight easier if I knowed you was tied up with a good man like him." "Yes, Dad," was all she said, for she had not the heart to tell him the truth, and she knew that Hale never would until the last moment. He must when he learned that she had failed. Half an hour later she could see the stone chimney of the little cabin in Lonesome Cove. A little further down, several spirals of smoke were visible, rising from unseen houses which were more miner shacks. Her father said that Hale had put up while she was gone. The water of the creek was jet black now. A row of rough wooden houses ran along its edge. The geese cackled a doubtful welcome. A new dog leaped barking from the porch, and a tall boy sprang after him, both running for the gate. "Why, Bub!" cried June, sliding from her horse and kissing him, and then holding him off at arm's length to look into his steady gray eyes and his blushing face. "Take the horses, Bub," said old Judd, and June entered the gate while Bub stood with the reins in his hand, still speechlessly staring her over from head to foot. There was her garden, thank God, with all her flowers planted, a new bed of pansies and one of violets, and the border of laurel in bloom, unchanged and weedless. "One of Jack Hale's men to take care of it," explained old Judd, and again with shame June felt the hurt of her lover's thoughtfulness. When she entered the cabin, the same old rasping, petulant voice called from her bed in one corner, and when June took the shriveled old hand that was limply thrust from the bedclothes, the old hag's keen eyes swept her from head to foot with disapproval. "My, but you're a wearin' mighty fine clothes," she croaked enviously. "I ain't had a new dress for more'n 5 years." And that was the welcome she got. "No?" said June appeasingly. "Well, I'll get one for you myself." "I'm much obliged," she whined, "but I reckon I can get along." A cough came from the bed in the other corner of the room. "That's Dave," said the old woman, and June walked over to where her cousin's black eyes shone hostile at her from the dark. "Sorry, Dave," she said, but Dave answered nothing but a sullen "Howdy," and did not put out a hand. He only stared at her in sulky bewilderment, and June went back to listen to the torment of the old woman's plaints until Bub came in. Then, as she turned, she noticed for the first time that a new door had been cut in one side of the cabin, and Bud was following the direction of her eyes. "Why, hain't nobody told you?" he said delightedly. "Told me what, Bub?" With a whoop, Bub leaped for the side of the door, and reaching up, pulled a shining key from between the logs and thrust it into her hands. "Go ahead," he said. "It's yourn." "Some more of Jack Hale's fool doin's," said the old woman. "Go on, gal, see what he's done." With eager hands she put the key in the lock, and when she pushed open the door, she gasped. Another room had been added to the cabin, and the fragrant smell of cedar made her nostrils dilate. Bub pushed by her and threw open the shutters of a window to the low sunlight, and June stood with both hands to her head. It was a room for her, with a dresser, a long mirror, a modern bed in one corner, a work table with a student's lamp on it, a washstand, and a chest of drawers, and a piano. On the walls were pictures, and over the mantel stood the one she had first learned to love. Two lovers clasped in each other's arms, and under them the words "Infanzol." "Oh, oh, oh," was all she could say, and choking, she motioned Bud from the room. When the door closed, she threw herself sobbing across the bed. Over at the Gap that night, Hale sat in his office with a piece of white paper and a lump of black coal on the table in front of him. His foreman had brought the coal to him that day at dusk. He lifted the lump to the light of his lamp, and from the center of it a mocking, evil eye looked back at him. The eye was a piece of shining black flint, and told him that his mine in Lonesome Cove was but a pocket of cannel coal and worth no more than the smoldering lumps in his grate. Then he lifted the piece of white paper. It was his license to marry June. End of chapter 23.